Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to video number 93 and audio season 4, episode 38 of Music is Not a Genre. Thank you, as always, for listening and watching. Don't forget, you can support this podcast at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre or at anchor.fm/musicisnotagenre. Donations and monthly subscriptions are absolutely welcome at both. My public hub is youtube.com/Nick DiMatteo, where you get this podcast and music and more. And the home on my website for every episode of this podcast, or the list of, oh my goodness, almost 4 complete seasons, is nickdimatteo.com/podcast. Welcome here, New York City. Beautiful spring days that we've had for most of this week. Really enjoying that and kind of starting to feel the end of the season coming, even though it's the middle of spring. It's the end of this podcast season very soon. This is the, third to last episode, I guess you would call it. I plan on doing 40 this season, which is more than ever, because I've been having a great year podcast-wise and want to share that. And I will probably also have some special things happening over the summer, so it's not totally quiet as I gear up to make some tweaks and changes for season 5 in the fall. So let's get to this week's topic. It is, as those of you who are watching can see, Belle Sebastian, When Quiet Was the Revolution. So I've talked quite often. I tend to repeat topics that are my favorites, which I think is a common thing. And I've talked quite often about cycles. I've talked quite often about how a new kind of music is, or even an artist or a song, is almost always an echo of something that came before it. Because if you consider that unless someone is raised by wolves in the woods, lives in a cave, and has never, encountered any human being, there is nothing in this world that is created in a vacuum. No matter how innovative or experimental or new something is, it was influenced by something else that came before it. And I think it's kind of cool that, in my title, I use the word revolution, and that in the essay that you read below, I start talking about cycles and how everything does run in cycles of various, sizes: macro, micro, nano, epochal, if you want to use that word, as big as you can get. And how both revolution and cycle have to do with things coming back around, right? Revolving. And I think that that's significant here for the band Belle Sebastian, but also for the kind of what else I'm throwing into this topic. And, some of the things that I wrote down in this essay that I am going to read, I don't often do that, but I think I like the way I worded them here. Every attention-grabbing shift and movement is a response to something that came before. Complex gives way to simple. So-called high art gives way to so-called low art. I hate those distinctions, but they're useful here to just talk about how people and groups of people and the zeitgeist kind of responds to, what came before it, and is either building on that or rejecting it and doing something else. And by the way, side note, I'm reading this free paper in New York this week, AM New York. And it was an interview with Benedict Cumberbatch, who I love, and I'm looking forward to seeing that new movie, the new Doctor Strange. And he started talking about the zeitgeist. He mentioned the zeitgeist 3 different times, and that's a word I've always loved. I've used it a few times. But either they have some kind of an autocorrect system there, or the person doing the editing had never heard the word before. My guess is the first one, because I don't know why anybody would replace it. What happened was that E, or the IE or EI, I guess, in zeitgeist was changed to IN, so then the word became zingiest. So you'd have to imagine Benedict Cumberbatch repeating the word zingiest, which isn't even the most common word. Just thought I'd throw that in there. Interesting and fun. Spelling, people, spelling. Brash and confrontational gives way to soft and inviting. Very important for this week's topic. Sarcasm and nihilism give way to sincerity and faith. And, in your life, the important part of life is relearning lessons. Now, that doesn't mean you didn't learn anything the first time or second or fifth. It means that each time you come across that same lesson, you're adding to the knowledge you have of it. You're learning something new. You're building upon it. But the truth is that in every life itself, any one person's life goes through cycles, and you're going to have things that come back around that you have to revisit, whether you like it or not, and find a way to reconcile. And if you have been doing your work, which is, living and growing, then you will find that the next time you come across this, it's going to feel the same in some ways and echo what happened before and what you learned before, but it's going to be different. And that difference comes from context and perspective. And that is absolutely the case with a band like Belle Sebastian, who I'll jump ahead a little, even though I've got more to say on this topic of cycles. They harken back to both the 1960s and 1980s, and I'll get into more detail later on that. And yet, as always, just like with the Elephant Six Collective of the mid-90s and beyond, they brought new things to the conversation. So they might have been echoes of older music, but there was something new. And it had to do partly with the sonic qualities and the lyrics, but it also had to do with the context in which it was created. And I'd like to get to this kind of illustration that I'm talking about here, having to do with cycles and having to do with how things come back around and how the next thing is often a response to the thing that came before it. This is a good way to say it. I think I put somewhere in the essay, that you could go back really to the first humanoid banging a rock with a bone and liking the sound enough to repeat it, or vocalizing something and finding that vocalization either pleasant or useful or both and repeating that. And from there, eventually music was formed, and every single thing that came after it was built on what came before it or as a response to something before it, and there's been cross-pollination. What we have found in studying languages and cultures is that there are different strains of languages. There's the Indo-European and the Uralic and all of that. But at some point, they crossed over either before their first kind of strongest existence or after, in kind of the cross-cultural exchanges that happen. So languages that came from completely different stems have been influenced by other languages, over the hundreds, thousands of years of language development. The same can be said of music, that we may not have been exposed in many ways to music of other cultures for a while, although, trade and people traveling and everything did assist in that. And the more we've become a global civilization, the more we've shared things, and it's so much easier to do that. Of course, you're getting that too. But the main point still stands, which is that everything new is built on everything else that came before it, or versions or pieces, portions of everything else that came before it. And so here's a quick, primer of that from the 70s, let's say the mid-70s through mid-90s, or maybe mid-O's, even to a certain extent. Punk, as we've been told so many times, among other things, was a response to the bombast of progressive rock and classic rock. It was stripped down and simple. Itself harkened back to the 3/4 chord progressions of the 1950s and the garage rock, of the 1960s. So again, it's an echo of things that came before it, but it was also a response to what came directly before it. Hair metal was, in its own way, a response to punk, in that it was trying to have more fun with the image, more fun with the music, and punk, in many ways, is very serious. Up until it wasn't always serious. You had funny punk bands and punk bands that understood humor, but the general kind of feeling that punk came into by the time the early 80s, mid 80s came around was a seriousness, this kind of a straight edge seriousness that hair metal wanted to poke holes in, and poke holes in the metal even that came before it, among other things. Again, this is a simplification. Grunge, we've been told, was a response to that excess of hair metal and the kind of falsity that whatever organic nature it started in with glam and men, predominantly men, wanting to explore other sides of their physicality and sexuality and appearance and all of that, and to expand the music. It eventually everything gets codified to the point where it becomes sort of a, if not a parody of itself, then kind of rigidified in a way that does it a disservice. And that has certainly happened with hair metal. And so grunge came along to kind of poke holes in that. But then you get to what we're talking about this week, which is one of my favorite words ever since I used to write poetry, which is twee. Just saying the word itself is twee. And go ahead and look up a definition, because I'm not going to be your dictionary here. But that idea of things kind of being precious and soft and delicate, carefully expressed even. And indie pop and another strain of music, post-rock, both of which existed before grunge. Grunge existed before grunge, if you want to get right down to it. What we know of as grunge existed before it became popular for many years. Those two quieter versions of music came along and started to take more hold in the zeitgeist, really, and in like popular culture in the mid 90s and especially late 90s. Oh man, allergies. Excuse me a second. And that, to me, in a certain way, was a response to grunge. It's not that grunge wasn't ever soft, didn't ever have, literary lyrics or delicate lyrics, or that it wasn't introspective, or that it wasn't clever and precious in its own way, or that it wasn't poppy. There were tons of hooks and things like that. But when you think of grunge, you think of stuff that slams you in the face. The word itself, it's really baked into that word. When you think of twee indie pop, you think of something that kind of invites you in, And I want to read this because I think this is kind of a good way to say it. Belle and Sebastian were a part of this movement that took what was existent beforehand and used it as a response to what was existing in the moment there. And I know that's kind of a repeat of what I've said a couple of times in this podcast, but I think it bears repeating, partly because I just lost my train of thought and I lost my place in my damn notes. So I, wanted to kind of bring it back to the mid thing here. This is why I don't read notes when I'm doing these podcasts, because you don't want, I don't want my presentation to feel canned or artificial or prepackaged in any way. I do my homework. I write my notes down. You've got the essay if you'd rather read things than listen or watch. But what I talk about, I tend to like it to be like I'm having a conversation at a bar, And unfortunately, there's something that I wanted to say about this, that I wish I could remember. And you'll have to read it down below. But it basically, what it sums up is that if you really listen closely and examine the kind of Belle and Sebastian era of indie pop has a lot in common with grunge. Not sonically, certainly, other than maybe certain production values in terms of EQ and things like that. But the way there was a disaffection, I think is a good word to use here, a disaffection in how things were being expressed, a sort of whatever attitude, even though there were things being talked about, sung about that were very serious, especially on a personal level, very serious. But at the same time, there wasn't sort of an overly sincere engagement with what was being sung. The grunge had a lot of kind of sarcasm to it, and in your face, fuck you. And the twee indie pop had a kind of a laid back, like, yes, of course I care, but in the end, does it really matter? And I know you may not really care either, so I'm just going to be here, and I hope that you come in. And that's, I think, sort of what I wanted to say, is that grunge was sort of like being invited into somebody's basement of angst, and very personal, but be prepared to suffer. And Belle Sebastian was kind of like being invited into somebody's living room of ennui, which itself is a form of angst, just maybe not as fiercely expressed. And if you were alive and sentient and absorbing music in the 1990s and into what was going on at the time, you will remember the power that grunge had when it kind of took the world by storm, because it was so direct and in your face compared to most of what came before it in at least the latter half of the 1980s. Then you may also remember that the popularity of grunge ran its course to the point where, yes, it did become, in some ways, a parody of itself towards the end of the 90s, especially, and in the early O's. It also spawned post-grunge and things that I've talked about before that was equally good music in its own way, both from the bands that started it, the way, for example, the Stone Temple Pilots changed its course a couple of times, or even Smashing Pumpkins evolved, or latter-day bands that took some of the mold of grunge and went into, like second or third wave emo, or whatever you want to call it. But the general consensus, and partly it was overkill, overplay, and partly it's bands trying to cash in, or much more likely record companies trying to cash in, but either one. And partly it was just, there's always room for something new, and people are always looking for something new. And even if you're a huge fan of anything, you do well to find an antidote to the thing that you're a fan of. Not because you've grown necessarily tired of the thing you're a fan of, but because you live a rich and full life that has more than one note to it. You're not just the person who works at their job, or the person who is a family person, or the person you are with your friends, or anything. You're all of those things and can bounce between them in the way that maybe when you've spent a day listening to, metal or grunge or some kind of, louder, more in your face music, you might want to spend a night listening to jazz or classical or folk or whatever it is. Or if you're constantly listening to new music, you might want some comfort food to listen to some old favorites or something like that. When Belle Sebastian came along, it was one of the things that happened during that period in the mid-90s where all of us were ready for new things. Doesn't mean I didn't still follow, again, Stone Temple Pilots in particular, or Smashing Pumpkins, those two really, through the latter half of that decade and beyond. But that as much as I loved and appreciated and still appreciate grunge music and its offshoots and all of that, I needed an antidote as well. And I had some already. I certainly listened to, 90s hip hop and pop and power pop in particular, Fountains of Wayne and Matthew Sweet. But some of those had some things in common with grunge in terms of how they hit you. Whereas Belle Sebastian, or a post-rock band like the Sea and Cake, listen to what I just did. I created, which I don't like to do, a few seconds of silence here. And that's because that's exactly what Belle Sebastian felt like to me. When I heard them, you were waiting for bands to up the ante or morph or add, new elements to grunge, but it would still just come at you, make you want to jump into the mosh pit or whatever, it is. And they were like, how quiet can we possibly be and still be utterly engaging? Just how amazingly quiet, like to the point where this music could never have existed without amplification, because somebody singing at the level that I believe it's Stuart Murdoch sings and sang could not have been heard in a crowd. And it doesn't mean that it's certainly not the first quiet or laid back music ever in existence. That's the whole idea of this, cycles and responses to things that came before it and echoes of what came before. But at the time, it was wholly unexpected that it would not just exist, but rise to a level of popularity. And it felt like the right kind of breath of fresh air that I certainly needed at the time, and an antidote to every kind of other in-your-face music that I was listening to at the time. And I don't honestly know, and only really care a little if anybody else kind of has this view of what went on there, because a lot of people get hung up on the influences part of things. And when I did, my episode on Elephant Six, I talked a lot about that. And I get that Belle Sebastian have music that harken back to the chamber pop or in its own way indie pop of the 1960s, like the Zombies, and that they absolutely were influenced or harken back to bands like the Smiths from the 80s, and that they had that kind of like 60s/80s influence going on in everything they did. And you do hear that. You absolutely, like if you hear, no one told me about her, the way she lied, like that song, man, that does have a very similar sonic quality to things that Belle and Sebastian did and do. Or if you listen to the Smiths and the kind of, there's a little bit of, I'm singing this and I do care, but I really don't care kind of feel with everything the very controversial Morrissey said at the time, which itself at the time, with Johnny Marr and the rest of the band was a revelation, because it was, again, intending to kind of do that, well, we are going to be anti-punk in a way. And hindsight's 2020, whatever, but take it in the spirit in which it was created in the context, of that decade. Belle and Sebastian did the same thing, but did it their own way, did it differently. And to me, it was, yes, of course, I think I felt that and heard that familiarity for music that I had already loved. So it was exciting to hear that. But honestly, listening to them never made me feel like I was listening to that older music. It felt new and fresh to me because they were moving the conversation forward. As I always say, they were doing something different. And doing something, taking something old and doing it in a different way. That's how I see that, that the title that I gave this one, Quiet Was the Revolution, applies here. Because we often think of anything related to a revolution as loud and attention-grabbing and noisy, but you can be just as attention-grabbing by, taking a moment of silence and then moving in and speaking intimately. That's been done thousands, hundreds of thousands of times by orators and in scenes in film and television and on stage when you're able to do it, and still project. If you're mic'd up, which I always prefer. And that's what Belle and Sebastian did. Let me get really quick to a discography of them. I don't want to go too far into it. I think they've released at least 10 albums, right? 96 Tiger Milk, which I have here. I'm pointing to it for you listeners. It's got a crack in the cover because it's an old CD. It's a very old CD. I probably didn't buy this until, 2000 is my guess, because I believe what happened was I started to get into, Belle and Sebastian with this album here, which I'm pointing to, Fold Your Hands, Child, You Walk Like a Peasant, which is still to this day, I believe, my favorite album of theirs, although I will talk about the new one that they just released, which I've always found exciting. The band's been around for a while, still releasing music. I'm going to talk more about that in my wrap-up at the end of the year, my kind of catch-up episode like I did last year. If You're Feeling Sinister, from 96, Tiger Milk kind of documents the formation of the band in a way, and the second one is often called their best album. I'm sure I've heard it at some point, and I think the reason I don't have it here is because I loaned it to somebody, and I never got it back. I hope they enjoy it. The Boy with the Arab Strap, which I have right here, named after another indie band, Arab Strap. They didn't appreciate being name-checked there. I don't know if they've changed their mind since then, but at the time they really didn't like that. Again, Fold Your Hands, Child, You Walk Like a Peasant. That's my fave. That's the one whose songs I remember the most. When I look back on the track listing, I was like, oh man, yeah. This is, I think, the album where I fell in love with them. But it was also, to me, the last of their classic period. And they had that kind of personnel shift when, Stuart Murdoch broke up and the woman left and someone else came along and some other things happened. And they started to bring in other influences and stuff like that, which good for them. But the last thing I ever bought of theirs was this this single here, Jonathan David. Belle and Sebastian sing Jonathan David from 2001. And, don't really have much of a memory of it. I think at the time I was having a shift and moving into other things like Hot Hot Heat and, the White Stripes and all those kind of people, Strokes, whatever was happening in the early O's. Storytelling was meant to be the soundtrack for a Todd Solondz film, but only 6 minutes of it were used. That's 2002, Dear Catastrophe Waitress in 2003. Trevor Horn, who freaking reinvented Yes for the 80s, and just you when you hear Trevor Horn, you think 1980s music, produced that 2003 album of theirs. The Life Pursuit 2006 is supposedly their most successful album to date, so 10 years on is when they had their biggest selling album. 4 years later, in 2010, Right About Love was almost equally successful. They came back 5 years later in 2015, Girls in Peacetime Wanna Dance, which, as the title suggests, was more dance-oriented. And I read something that said that Stuart Murdoch had always wanted to incorporate more Northern soul into his music, and that certainly happened in the couple of albums there in the 2000s. Days of the Bagnalled Summer was also a soundtrack of 2019. Haven't listened to it yet. I haven't done my chronology here for Belle and Sebastian, but I do plan to do that. I'm going to re-listen to all of their stuff that I've heard and listen to the stuff I haven't heard. A bit of previous, released this year, their new album, to me, sounds very natural, not at all forced, not like they are deliberately trying to recreate anything they've done, more like they're taking bits of everything they've done and putting it all together, which is interesting to me because a couple of the albums that have been released by older bands this year, including Red Hot Chili Peppers, I feel like bands are doing that. And I wonder if it's because through the pandemic, you do your own reflection and retrospection and all of that, and you fall back in love with your identity and various identities that you've had through your past. And what you come up with is an amalgamation, a combination of all of those things. And I really feel like A Bit of Previous is that for them, and is probably at the moment, I won't say it's my second favorite album of theirs behind Fold Your Hands, Child, because I don't remember the other ones well enough. I'm going to have to listen to all of them, but I will say that it is at least in the top 3 or 4. It's absolutely worth a listen if you're into this kind of music at all. Quick side note, 2 side notes before I get into connecting this with Rex music, which, is obviously one of my favorite parts of any podcast. And that is that Belle and Sebastian kind of foreshadowed the indie pop explosion in the early 2010s with I don't know why I always remember this as being the one that pops in the mind. Gautier is somebody that I used to know, was one of the most successful indie pop songs, certainly of the time. And when you fast forward and go to bands and artists like MxG and Japanese Breakfast today, you really hear that pedigree in that music. Now, indie pop as a genre has been around, I think, since at least the 70s, if not longer. But early the 70s. And has had its own iterations throughout every decade. But there's always a change when something that's been around for a while hits the mainstream. And even though Belle Sebastian had their successes, they didn't necessarily hit the level of success that indie pop would start to have in the 2010s, carrying all the way through to today. There's actually probably more indie pop out there, Lorde and even Billie Eilish, than there ever has been, which makes me excited for what's coming next, because it's been around a while now, and I have a kind of feeling what's coming next, and I've talked about it before. But it's, I wanted to make that connection because I think that there is a connection there. And also that the one band that kind of straddled all these changes from grungy, kind of harder edged, to power pop, to softer, in some ways folksier, but definitely quiet and introspective, to electronic post-rock, sea and cakey kind of stuff, was Radiohead. From the late 80s through till whenever. Every time they made a change, they were kind of mapping out, in a very personal way, these changes in the zeitgeist. And they certainly didn't do it because they were following anybody, to my knowledge. But they do kind of encapsulate that shift. And I remember being intrigued by post-rock when it started to become a thing. And yeah, it had been around since at least the 80s, if not longer than that. You can even go back as far as Brian Eno from the 70s and say, well, he was sort of proto-post-rock. But as intrigued as I was by it, I was also a little bit annoyed by it. Because I was like, every 5-10 years, somebody says rock is dead and here's the new thing. Nothing ever really dies. Yes, if you were a music lover, you know that I just gave you the definition of the acronym for the band NERD, Pharrell Williams' band. NERD stands for Nothing Ever Really Dies. I didn't intend to do that. So I don't script things. See? Fun stuff. So, yes, when Belle Sebastian came along, and when I discovered them, let's say, it was at a point when I had been doing grunge-influenced music. I had been doing power pop. I have been doing even pop rock. I don't even know what else you want to call it. Funky kind of music. And even though I had done quieter music prior to that, I really started to embrace that side more, say with a song like On the Way Down, which is more depressing than most of what Belle and Sebastian have done, but it's that same idea of being cool with being quiet, But it's not a precious song. To me, even though I've not done a ton of songs like that, the perfect embodiment of the influence that Belle and Sebastian has had on me is a more recent song called The Garden. It's from Rex's album Sympathy for the Weird. And it is in its own way one of the weirdest songs from any of the Weird Objective albums. It was intended, and it is, I believe, to be as laid back as humanly possible, and certainly as possible for me, who tends to be a little more frenetic and demonstrative in many ways. The way that I produced it was that kind of laconic, like it is moving along and there is momentum and you are feeling it, but you're going to have to really be, welcome to be invited in to the garden, I guess. And the way I sang it was certainly, there's not an ounce of projection in anything I sing. And even though I have a different accent, certainly, I'm not from Glasgow, the way Belle and Sebastian are, and had slightly different intentions for the lyrics, you will 100% hear the influence there. And I urge you to stay tuned next minute or two after I wrap this up to listen to that song and to also go ahead and check it out on the link that I gave you there on Rex Bandcamp page or on any streaming service and add it to your playlist. Why not? But if you're a fan of Belle Sebastian, I'm pretty darn certain that you're going to be a fan of the song The Garden from Rex Sympathy for the Weird. And I appreciate you listening to it either way. Were you into these guys, the Belle and Sebastian? Do you remember that impact that they had the way I do, or do you not? Do you put them in a different context than a response to the kind of in-your-faceness of a lot of the music that was happening at the time? Were there other quiet bands of that era, or even of a different era, that you felt had the same impact on you? They were a response to what was going on in a way that kind of pulled you in, you know? The kind of things that were happening with bands like Led Zeppelin in the late 60s, and then you had somebody like James Taylor. You know, so like that kind of dichotomy. What do you think of Belle and Sebastian's new album, A Bit of Previous? The more I listen to it, the more I enjoy it. I listened to the early release of kind of the 3 singles, and I liked, was particularly one of them on there, but the album itself is just very rich and diverse and heartfelt, I think. Again, I don't think it's any kind of a ploy. I think it was them intentionally doing the things they wanted to do. And I'd love to know your opinion on this, your opinion on anything that I have said, agree or disagree. What did I miss? What did you love? Because as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. 2 more episodes left this season. I'll see you next week.
Oh my love, you wait for me in the garden. Oh my love, you wait for me in the garden. The garden is full of people. People don't like me. I don't like them. The garden is full of people. People don't like me, and I don't like them. Oh my love, you wait for me in the garden. Oh my love, you wait for me in the garden. The garden is growing time. Time don't like me, and I don't like it. Garden is growing time. Time don't like me, and I don't like Oh my love, you wait for me in the garden. Oh my love, you wait for me in the garden. The garden is full of people. People don't like me, and I don't like them. The garden is full